Imagine it's 1978. You are magically transported to the floor of a huge factory in a provincial Soviet city. There is a group of workers that are men and women. They are gathered around a small table, and seemingly they're not working. You go close and then you see that they are playing dominoes and drinking tea. You stay there for a moment watching, and it seems that they have been at work for more than 3 hours. You go up to them and then ask like, hey, what is wrong? Why aren't you guys working? And then the foreman says that we haven't received the raw material. It has been 2 days delayed and we have really nothing else to do. Seeing your bewildered expression, the foreman chuckles and then says, hey, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. This is very hard for you to comprehend, but then the scene changes. You are now magically transported to a secret Soviet science city with a really high security. You are inside a pristine laboratory. A team of scientists and engineers are huddled together around a table, arguing intensely. You see that they are working 12-hour days. They are driven by patriotism and professional pride and under immense pressure. Seemingly, they are designing a new guidance system for a rocket or a new alloy for a nuclear reactor. The work is absolutely brilliant. It's cutting edge, it is relentless, and it is very, very real. Both of these scenes are the Soviet Union. Now, there is a joke that is often said tongue-in-cheek that I already said. The joke is that we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us about the Soviet Union. For people not familiar with the Soviet Union, it gives the impression as if the whole nation epitomized apathy and the whole nation was inefficient and the whole nation was stagnant. And while there is some truth to that joke, we must also never forget that the USSR produced some of the most staggering scientific and industrial achievements in human history. So how do we reconcile that? In this video, I want to take a deep dive into the slogan. How real was it? What was the pretend work? If everybody pretended to work, then who achieved all those miraculous achievements that I mentioned? But to understand it fully, we have to first grasp the background. We need to see what this country was at its very beginning and what it achieved. When the Bolsheviks took over, they inherited the Russian Empire. In 1897, the literacy rate was just 28.4%. More than 60% of the population couldn't read. At that time, life expectancy was brutal, 30 years, and 1 in 4 children died before their first birthday. By the end, in 1989, the Soviet Union had a highly educated population, almost 100% literacy rate. They almost eradicated illiteracy. It was a fundamentally different country. 73.6% urbanized in its core republic. And by the late 1950s, Soviet life expectancy had soared to 68.7 years. Briefly, for a moment, surpassing that of the United States, despite having a 17-year lead at the beginning of the century. That crossover point, the late 1950s and early 1960s, is the key. This was the peak. The slogan comes after, in the 1970s, when that progress stalled, and the gap with the West in both health and economics started to widen again. The mistake is thinking that there was only one Soviet Union. The truth is that there were two existing side by side. The one that achieved that stunning catch-up and the one that created that pretend work slogan. But why? Why were there two Soviet Unions? Why this bifurcation? From its birth, the Soviet Union was an outcast. It was immediately hit with an Allied economic blockade. And during the entire Cold War, there was a Western coalition called COCOM that systematically blocked the sale of any high technology, which was computers or microelectronics or advanced tools, to the USSR. They were locked out. And we have to be clear that this was not a very friendly competition. From its birth, the USSR was seen as a regime to be toppled, and it was under constant threat for its own survival. The West, which was led by the US, engaged in a decades-long arms race and economic warfare with the explicit goal of pressuring the Soviet system. The US economy, without any doubt, was vastly larger, but the USSR was forced to spend a crippling portion of its much smaller economy just to maintain military parity. When your entire state is geared towards survival in this existential high-stakes competition, your priorities kind of change. Building a steel mill that churns out material for tanks, it becomes infinitely more important than building a factory that makes consumer goods, like shoes. Of course, I am vastly simplifying it, but for the purpose of our discussion, that will have to do. Okay, so this created two distinct eras of work long before the stagnation set in. First, the 1930s, which had the Stakhanovite movement. So on August 31st, 1935, Alexei Stakhanov, which was a 30-year-old miner, he hewed 102 tons of coal during his 6-hour shift. This amount represented 14 times his quota, and within a few days, this feat was hailed by Pravda as the world record. This was celebrated by the party and then turned into a movement, which was very much intentional. Its goal was to shatter existing work rate norms and justify the introduction of Western-style production organization. And it urged workers to achieve greater productivity. The workers were actually rewarded with material gains. They got higher salaries and then cars and then houses, and they were actually used as sort of like advertisement so that this is what you can achieve if you are much productive. Second, the 1940s and 50s, which was the Great Patriotic War and the Reconstruction. This was the absolute peak of the Soviet real work narrative. The USSR defeated Nazi Germany and then engineered an astonishing post-war reconstruction. The economic growth was just explosive. From 1950 to 1980, Soviet GNP per capita growth equaled that of the OECD, and it significantly exceeded that of the United States, 3.3% per year versus 1.9% for the US. Again, the Soviet economy was much smaller than the US, but we are talking about the rate of growth. And this brings us to the 1970s, the era of zastoy, or stagnation. This is where our slogan is born. The economic slowdown that was identified by historians was real, and it was felt by everyone. But this is the caveat that you almost never hear. The 1970s were a rough decade for everyone, including the West. Western estimates show that from 1970 to 1980, Soviet per capita GNP growth, while falling, was still roughly similar to that of the United States and the European OECD countries, which was averaging around 2% per year. So if their stagnation was on paper comparable to the West, why did the system feel so broken? Why did it come up with this pretend work slogan? So what really happened? And this is where the story gets a little complicated. For decades, the Western assumption was that the whole system was just hopelessly inefficient. The whole Soviet command economy was grossly inefficient. But when economists in the 1990s actually measured the technical efficiency, basically how much waste there is inside the production process of some Soviet civilian plants, the results were quite shocking. There is one study of a Soviet cotton refineries that found that they were operating at 92.9% technical efficiency. A similar study of US generating plants at the time was 90.4%. So they weren't inefficient at all, seen from this report. But the killer fact, even much like shocking than that, is that economists then asked that, okay, maybe they were not getting enough resources, as I showed in the example in the beginning of the video. What if we provided all the raw material that the factories needed, all the resources, civilian resources, all the machines, to their most perfect 100% efficient use, which was called the allocative efficiency, so no shortages of raw material? The gains would be huge, right? And the answer was no. Even if the allocated efficiency of the Soviet Union was working at the same level as the United States, it wouldn't increase the output by much. There would be a boost of about 1.5 to 2.9%, which is kind of shocking, considered how much we hear about the Soviet efficiency and the shortages. So the thing is that this is the core of the paradox. What I'm trying to say is that the problem wasn't just clumsy planners sending resources to the wrong factory. The problem was that entire civilian sector as a whole was being starved, like it didn't exist. There weren't enough resources to put raw material into at all. And how does this relate to creating this slogan? Because the thing is that the real work Soviet, that the high-tech work that they were doing was actively draining the pretend work Soviet, the space program, the VPK, the secret cities, the heavy industry. They got all the resources, the best engineers, the best steel, the best computers. It wasn't really an accident or a mistake. It was the feature. The civilian sector was the residual claimant. It wasn't even developed. The Soviet economy successfully transitioned from a largely agrarian economy to the steel and heavy industry in record time. Natural progress should have been towards mass production of consumer goods like cars and then electronics to develop further, as most of the economies had done. But that really never happened, and it choked. The system faltered, and then it was unplugged. Coming back, this priority on the heavy industry and the defense creates a powerful psychological bias. What you see daily has a much higher impact on your reality than what you don't see. Nobody saw the real work, the brilliant achievements of the VPK and the Novgorods, the secret Soviet high-tech cities that they were doing, because those were state secrets. They were hidden and never really talked about. But what every Soviet citizen saw was the other economy. They saw the shoddy clothes, the 10-year wait for a car, and the empty grocery shelves. And that visible daily experience of shortage and apathy is what gave the cynical slogan its universal power, even if it wasn't the whole truth. And the thing is that pretend work wasn't really laziness, like those people sitting around playing dominoes. They weren't lazy. It was just a response to the system whose rules were broken by this constant starvation. There are three main features that really made this problem worse. Okay. All the symptoms were there, but what really made it worse were these three things. First, the Soviet system basically guaranteed you a job. This sounds great. But it meant it was almost impossible to fire anyone, which meant that you needed to work. You had to create constant economic activity at full steam to make sure that the work was constantly happening. If you neglected a sector, that meant that you are still paying wages, no matter how small, without any output. Number one. The second was the ratchet effect. So if your factory's goal was to meet the state plan, and for example, if you exceeded that, you overproduced your quota, the state wouldn't give you a medal. It would just ratchet up your quota for the next year, which would make your life almost impossible. Again, this isn't unique to the Soviet Union. We see it happening in our capitalist economies as well. For example, if a department doesn't fulfill its budget, then the next budget allocation is reduced. And if you want to understand it in a fun way, you can watch the 10th episode of The Office season 5, which is called The Budget Surplus. Okay, number 3, and that is Shturmovchina, or storming, because the only thing that mattered was meeting your quota at the end of the month. The workflow was kind of absurd. For the first 3 weeks, you would just pretend to work, waiting for those materials, and then a frantic storm of like 24/7 work to hit the magic number before the end of the month so that you could hit your quota. Meeting the number that was given was more important than anything. There is a satirical cartoon with a giant nail hanging from the crane, and the person is asking who would need that. And the manager replies that what matters is that we meet the targets. It doesn't matter who needs it or not. But again, this isn't just unique to Soviet Union. For example, the UK has a shared rural network program that aimed to provide 4G coverage to 95% of the country. This is defined as the 95% of the geographical areas. So in order to meet the target, companies building telecom masts, they build those in areas with no people at all, just to meet that quota. They were providing 4G to deers and sheep. Again, I am not saying that there is an excuse for shortages and the systemic failures, but we have to understand that those problems were just not unique to Soviet Union only. Okay, moving on. So if they didn't work in the factories, then what were they doing? What they were doing was they were working in the second economy. This was the unofficial and entrepreneurial and highly energetic black market. It had the shabashniki, which were the illegal freelance construction crews who worked fast and hard for really high salaries. By some estimates, almost half of the construction work in some regions were done by these shabashnikis. It had the dacha, the little weekend cottage with its garden plot. As one historian noted, that the same workers who were moderately industrious at the factory devoted their labor to tending the vegetable garden with a great deal more enthusiasm. And here's the final paradox. The pretend work of the first economy was what enabled the real work of the second. Your official job gave you a guaranteed, although tiny salary. It gave you the time to moonlight because everyone was pretending. Yeah. And famously, it gave you the tools which you borrowed from the factory. The pretend work was the price of admission you paid to do the real work that actually improved your life. So, after all this, back to our slogan. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. There is some truth to it. It was a symptom of a broken social contract of the late stage civilian Soviet consumer economy. I have to be specific to it. It was a symptom of the broken social contract of the late stage civilian consumer Soviet economy. But to paint all 280 million Soviet citizens with that broad brush is a profound disservice. It ignores the generation that transformed their country, the one that went from 28% literacy and 30-year life expectancy to 100% literate industrial superpower. It ignores the doctors and the teachers who worked for prestige, not really pay. And most of all, it ignores the scientists in these closed cities like Sarov or these engineers in the space program. Those people performed real work at the highest level imaginable possible. If there is one thing that I want you to take from this, it's not whether USSR was a failed state or that communism is better than capitalism or vice versa. What I want you to take is that those people that built a nation, from the worker, the coal miner, all the way to the scientist, those people were not lazy. Those people were not apathetic. They were innovative. They were productive. And to use the slogan as a way to justify that somehow those people were worse than us or we are somehow better than us, that I think is a profound disservice. I am myself an engineer. I work in the European automotive industry. And for something even small as a bolt that you have to put in a car, there's immense amount of engineering that goes into it. Global supply chains, designing and everything. And to imagine that those people in the Soviet Union, they put first ever satellite in the orbit. They put the first man out in space. They put the first woman out in space. To have those kind of achievements, that just blows my engineering mind, and to do that with all the stuff that was happening around you. So yeah, it is very tempting to leave this story in the past. It is very tempting to say that, okay, Soviet Union finished, this is over. But then, as I keep mentioning it, our world, we hear similar echoes. We are now hearing this thing called quiet quitting or presenteeism. The late anthropologist David Graeber wrote a whole book on the phenomena of bullshit jobs, and he pointed to the Soviet Union as a classic example. He said that it was a system that created millions of useless jobs just to keep everyone employed. But then again, this book is about our system. He said that more than half of our jobs in our current economy and system are just useless. They don't serve any purpose. So I leave you with the final question. This pretend work slogan, do you think it was a unique feature of the communist ideology, that it was a natural outcome of communism that just happened in that system? Or was it something more closer? Was it something more related to us? Something more universal? I would like to know your thoughts because I have shared mine. I would really like to know what you think down in the comments. And if you have been watching this far, thank you so much. And I would really like to hear from you down in the comments about what topics should I cover next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.